doing that, we actually had 2 young people who were still incarcerated who participated via Skype. And then they had been released, and we had a meeting in Baltimore. It was the first time these 2 young people were able to attend in person. So one of our staff folks decided to take them all out to dinner. Took them to what for Baltimore passes as a fancy restaurant. And it was a group of about 15, 20 young people, mostly young people of color, and they were excited. They'd had a great day, and they were being young people. They were a little boisterous, a little bit loud, and the staff person who was with them was getting a little bit anxious because this was a very nice restaurant. And sure enough, across the way there was an older couple, a white couple, and they kept looking and whispering and looking and whispering, and our staff person was more nervous. And the gentleman gets up from the table and starts walking toward our group. And now our staff person is really anxious because he's afraid the young people are going to be embarrassed. And the gentleman walks up and he says, so where'd you match? And the young people are looking at each other, staff person, they're all like confused. Well, it turns out this gentleman was a physician. And just by coincidence, that day was what's called match day, when graduates of medical school learn where their residency is going to be. And he saw these young people and assumed that they were there celebrating their match. The point of that is when you talk about social norms, that at the point where we can see every young person as having the kind of future that this gentleman assumed because of the setting of the fancy restaurant and they were all dressed nice, etc., if we could see every young person from the time they're babies with that kind of potential, that's the norm that we have to change. It's not just about juvenile justice, it's about thinking about all of our young people having value from the very beginning.
I also want to add, Stacey, that there's, as you know, there's actually science and evidence behind everything that we're talking about. We started out by hearing that juvenile crime is going down and juvenile detention is going down. You would have said that to the norm people and they would have said that's crazy. It's not crazy. There's actually evidence behind that. The other thing in the victims field, and I think I alluded to earlier, I always ask people, don't broad brush. If someone tells you they know what victims need, don't pay attention to them. Ask victims what they need. And the other thing that we're talking about, and please read the full 129-page report on your way home. It's important because we need to individualize what these kids need. And I think you spoke about it so eloquently. We can't keep broad brushing, and that's what happens with social norms. Everyone thinks they know how everyone feels or should think, and we have to stop doing that and look at the individual people as we do with victims. We don't move forward with victims without being very specific on what they need. Why can't we be doing the same with the kids who we're making decisions about, lock them up and throw away the key?
How are we doing time-wise? The clock in front of here is, I'm not sure I'm understanding it. We've got 5 minutes? Okay, we've got 5 minutes. Okay, we had another question?
Hi, I'm Nicole, Victim Support Services out of Everett, Washington, and we primarily serve to all age ranges, and the big issues we have are regarding mental health. So when you're talking restorative justice across the board, specifically with children, how are you guys implementing that into the restorative process?
I don't understand the question. The mental health?
So providing mental health services for restoration, because you're looking at youth now being considered for civil commits and long-term commitment.
Yeah. I could just say I'm working in a number of states on, in particular, restorative justice conferencing with a group called Impact Justice. Again, a big part of that work is doing the initial assessment of the crime survivor and of the youth. And part of that is looking at histories of trauma. ACE to me is one of the most important tools we have. Mental health needs, looking at substance use disorder and whether it's been in the family for generations, so that you get that information in order to be able to really come up with a good case plan for that youth. Really important.
Long pass.
Long pass.
My name is Paul Monis. I'm an attorney representing victims of sexual abuse, but probably before half the people in this audience were born, maybe a little more, starting in 1978. I worked doing juvenile justice reform, and I'm wondering, I worked for a program in West Virginia representing kids in mental hospitals and prisons, and worked around the country with a number of lawyers through Office of Juvenile Justice to try to reform this program. And what I'm hearing, it's not a criticism, kind of criticism, but what I'm hearing is exactly what we talked about 40 years ago. So, and the exact same, I mean, the scripts are the same, you all are, I mean, I was talking to conferences, but it was 35 and 40 years ago about this. And there are names of people who have now, who are dead now, experts such as yourselves, who gave their lives for this. Jerry Miller, who was the head of the Office of Youth Justice in Massachusetts, wrote a book called Over the Wall, published in the 80s, which was based on his experience opening up Massachusetts youth reform facilities for kids. We know all this stuff. We know that in 1987, the United States Supreme Court declared the death penalty for teenagers unconstitutional in a case called Thompson versus Oklahoma, because the American Psychiatric Association and all these other organizations said that kids who commit the worst kinds of murder have histories of abuse, histories of maltreatment, and that was 87, that's 31 years ago. Have you all, or have we come, because right now I'm just involved in representing victims of abuse, sexual abuse against large institutions like the Catholic Church and the Boy Scouts, etc., but where are we going? I mean, what the hell is going on? Is there something happening that's a little different that happened 40 years ago?
Yeah, we're all saying
Okay,
yes,
I think
there is.
you were, I didn't realize it, Paul, but you set this up perfectly, because that was kind of what we were going to end on, so I will let Patrick answer for you.
I'll do my best. And Paul, I think you know a lot of this history, so a number of things are different. You left out, because you weren't going to cover every decade, but we had a decade in the 90s where norms did change, where there was this notion of a generation of super predators that were going to descend upon us, and that's when incarceration trends just went through the roof. I was running a system during the 90s, and I remember what it was like. We just kept getting more and more and more and more kids being sent our way. So that one of the changes is that whole theory, which is what it was, has been completely debunked. Exactly when they were saying crime was going to go through the roof, crime dropped and dropped and dropped. So that was one thing. The other thing, there was also a publication that I'm sure you're aware of called Nothing Works, which basically said in criminal justice nothing works because they looked at research in the past. Since then, we now have evidence of interventions that do work other than incarceration. So I think that's a huge change. And finally, the numbers themselves are very different than during Jerry Miller's time. Jerry was really pulling a very radical experiment in Massachusetts when he tried to reform the institutions and said, I can't reform them, I'm just going to empty them out, and created the network that he created. We are now seeing, not just in a couple of states, but across the country, we're seeing states really change the way they fund, the way they finance. We're seeing both on the progressive side, on the conservative side, people coming together and saying what we're doing isn't working. So I really do think this is a moment in time, and we have a choice. If we don't act now, I believe that 30 years from now we'll be repeating the cycle. But if we act now and recognize that we've shrunk the population in these institutions enough, we've created enough opportunities and alternatives that we can put in place, this is the time, this is the moment where we can actually we can set it up so we won't repeat the failures of the past that happened in the 90s when there's another sort of push for, well, let's just lock people up.
Can I just give you, Paul, my bumper sticker of the giant report that we're talking about today, which I think is different from the 80s, is that youth detention is down, youth crime is down, and victim survivor satisfaction is up. So is that different from 30-some years ago? I think it is. I think it is.
Well, and just to echo, and thank you, Paul, for your comment and for your work over the years. I don't think this conversation in these communities was happening in the past. Right?
Your tie is fine. Your mic is off.
I can't control that. folks hear me? Thank you. So, Patrick laid out how things have changed over the years. Not enough, right? We still have a lot of work to do, and I appreciate the sense of urgency because I've been doing this for 30 years also. But this is a different conversation with two communities that I think have not been in dialogue and putting forth recommendations, right? I think, having people like Aswad at the table, bringing his perspective, I didn't see that years ago, right? His organization, the National Center for Victims of Crime, coming to the table and saying that what politicians and DAs are saying, that this is what victims want, that's not necessarily true, that's different. And I think we're at a moment of time where that information can help to hold people accountable to start to do what we know works, right? So I'm excited about that. If I could ask people just to do one thing when you go home, ask somebody in the juvenile justice field who's the decision maker, are they collecting ACE's information?
Yeah.
If they're not, tell them they have to, right? Because if we don't have that information, we can't serve these young people and meet their needs, and then we're just going to continue what's been going on. So we're making great progress, but we got work to do, and I'm really excited to be working with NCVC and the folks in this room to continue that effort.
Okay, I'm getting we're done, but who would like the
Sorry.
last
Big
word?
finish right here.
Aswad.
Yes, I just want to add that stopping the cycles of crime means stopping the cycles of trauma, right? So if we're able to put, survivors at the center of public policy, then we're able to change the criminal justice system, whether at the juvenile level, at the adult level, and make sure that crime survivors get the things that they need to help them heal and to make all of our communities be safer.
Amen. Good.
Okay, one big round of applause for all our panelists. And for our mic runners, so nobody got hit in the head. Okay, so I've been reminded of two mistakes. Well, one mistake I made and something I forgot was I flipped the plenaries.